Thousands of graves fill this ornate cemetery in downtown Atlanta. The dead here were Civil War soldiers who fought for the Southern Rebellion that attempted to break apart the United States more than 150 years ago. Not far away is a statue and monument dedicated to Henry Grady, a celebrated civic leader in the 1880s who defined Atlanta as a dynamic and modern place, the capital of a New South liberated from its history of slavery. Yet those soldiers who gave their lives were also fighting to preserve the cruelty of slavery. That civic leader was also a blatant white supremacist who preached that white people were superior to African Americans and black people should not expect to be treated as equal citizens. Let's remember that complicated history today, especially in an era when the Black Lives Matter movement and other national dialogues have compelled millions of Americans to reconsider their own views on race, to ask whether lurking inside all of us are the attitudes that trigger discrimination, lead to structural racism that we may not even recognize, or contribute to violent reactions by police officers. What do we do with all that history, and what are its connections to the present? Those questions are why we need this crucial conversation. Welcome to Crucial Conversations from the main stage of the Rialto Center for the Arts at Georgia State University in downtown Atlanta. I'm Doug Blackmon, and joining me on the stage tonight are Kenneth Lockett, a junior political science major from New York City, Daniel Varitek, a former editor-in-chief of the Georgia State University student newspaper, who graduated last May with a degree in marketing, and Ada Wood, another former editor-in-chief who finishes at Georgia State next May and is currently a news intern at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. We invited you guys to come on to this program because a little less than a year ago, you wrote, all three of you were involved in writing an editorial in the student newspaper at Georgia State calling for the removal of a statue and a monument in downtown Atlanta of a very famous civic leader from the 19th century, Henry Grady. And a few days ago, we asked all of you to meet up with us out at that monument to talk a little bit about your views on it. So let's take a look at that.
He was an orator, and he spoke a lot. When he spoke to Northern audiences, he painted a very cordial picture of relations between white and black Americans. But to Southern audiences, he painted a very different picture, one in which black Americans were intended to be deliberately held beneath white Americans.
So I think that monuments like this actually stand for something much bigger. And I think if you try to get into the argument that it's just a statue or it's just history, you're missing the point. And really the point is that we still have systemic racism supported by people in positions of power promoting racist ideologies, just like Grady did. And the fact that he's able to stand here and be put on a pedestal, be celebrated, is absolutely absurd. And I think the fact that we can still argue over whether that should be the case or not shows that we're not scratching the surface on the bigger issue if we're still, arguing over something so simple, and we're just asking for the bare minimum, and he has got to go. Things like this have to go.
People like Henry Grady, they've done great things for the city of Atlanta. Henry Grady was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. He really helped build the city of Atlanta after the Civil War. But that doesn't negate the fact that he was a racist, and he really, put black people underneath white Americans.
So, Kenneth, when we had you out at the monument, you talked about the contradictory role that this person, Henry Grady, played in Atlanta more than 100 years ago. But I imagine that's someone that 5 years ago, if you're from New York City, is that even a person you'd ever heard of before you came to Georgia State? And how did it come to pass that you became aware of even who that person was? The statue in the middle of this street in downtown Atlanta, and then even more so to come to a conclusion that it shouldn't be there anymore.
Right. So Henry Grady is a popular figure in the city of Atlanta, but most people don't even realize it. You have Henry Grady High School, you have the Henry Grady Journalism School. I believe they're changing it now. I'm not sure if they actually finalized that. And then you have, Grady Memorial Hospital. Henry Grady, while many Atlanteans might not know it, when you look at Henry Grady, you're like, oh, okay, New South, everything's good, everything's rosy. But then when you actually read what he said, he's like, oh, that's not exactly quite the picture you were trying to paint.
But so Grady, let's just fill in the details a little bit for those who people may have heard the name. For anyone who lives in Atlanta who has ever been through Atlanta, then they almost certainly would have heard of Grady Hospital, like you mentioned, which is a big downtown hospital, one of the larger high schools in the city named after him. As you said, the journalism school at the University of Georgia. But outside of Atlanta, he would be remembered by particularly students of the South as the inventor of the term the New South. And this guy who was editor of the Atlanta Constitution, then the biggest newspaper in Atlanta and in the entire South, and today still essentially that same scale and importance. But the way that most people remember him is as this New South guy. I mean, that was specifically as opposed to being the Old South. And the Old South was slavery, and the South that triggered the Civil War, all these bad things. And so Grady, most people who know anything about him, I think, are going to associate him with reform and progress and a different kind of South, a better kind of South. So what is it about him, more as specific as you can be, that's problematic?
Right. Well, I think that this dichotomy that is painted of Henry Grady, this difference in messaging that he gave to a northern audience versus a southern audience, is really at the heart of this. Yeah, I think like most people and like most historical figures, Henry Grady is a complicated and dynamic person. I don't think that our editorial was meant to, distill such a dynamic person down into one sentence, right? I think that we can agree that Henry Grady did good things for the South and for Atlanta. He, in his speeches to northern audiences, courted investments. He was trying to make Atlanta and the South in general a more industrial society, which I don't think anyone would disagree was a wise move coming out of the Civil War. But that picture that he painted to southern audiences, to audiences that perhaps he was more comfortable with, that he interacted with more often, he was regularly talking about how there was this social structure that had to be maintained, that despite the fact that we needed to move to an industrial society, we still should maintain this outdated and very racist social structure that arguably propelled us into the Civil War in the first place.
So the idea is that while he talked of the New South, talk of a South that wasn't reliant completely on cotton as one crop and totally agricultural, and so this guy who promulgates and publicizes and pushes out this notion, which also was the notion of cooperation with the North and reunification of a divided country and those sorts of things. So the idea is that behind all of that, there's actually this deeply racist person who's also very harmful. But so Ada, why don't you talk about that? So the editorial comes out a little less than a year ago, and I think somewhat unexpectedly, there had not been this was before the Black Lives Matter protests of the past year that got so much attention, and it wasn't like there had been people crusading in the streets to take down the Henry Grady monument. And so how was it that you guys landed on this idea, or the necessity of it, and then how did people react after you published the editorial?
I think we just kind of came together and saw something that we felt was important enough that we needed to write about it, and we felt we had the right facts, the right words to put together, and the right team put together to actually say something and maybe have an impact. I don't think that there was necessarily any reason other than that we saw there was something wrong that needed to be changed. I think it was well received. Students really liked it. Readers really liked it. Faculty at Georgia State liked it. And we had outside publications putting attention on it. I think there was an AP story that was carried to several publications like the New York Times and CNN. And the Atlanta Journal-Constitution covered it. It seemed well received. I never really heard any major criticism. I'm sure there are people that would disagree with the points we made, but I think students really liked it and agreed with it, and we're hoping for the same change we were.
What was the very beginning of it? Was it in some fashion, because there has been this running debate that we'll talk more about related to Confederate monuments, and that had been very much in the news before you guys wrote this editorial. But was it somehow an outgrowth of that, of a recognition that, there's also, because it's not a Confederate monument. Henry Grady was too young to have been a Confederate soldier of any age, and But yeah, so how exactly did it get started? Do you remember?
Me and Danny and another staff member, Will Solomons, went to the records room of Georgia State to try to get some records from the records keeper. And we came across the fact that Grady was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution at the time. And I remember, I think you dove a little bit deeper into that and we had found some things about him, but I think Danny would remember a little bit more where it started. Do you?
Yeah, I think, and I mean, to your point, I think that one of the catalysts for writing this was that we recognized we had a platform that we could message this out on. I think that's the first thing. We realized that we weren't just any students at Georgia State. We realized that, well, we have this platform with thousands of papers going out a week and much more online, and that if we built a strong case for this, that we could message it appropriately and to an appropriate audience, and that audience ended up being Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. But I think, yeah, we did take trips up to the library very often.
And we stumbled across some facts about Grady and his influence in the city. And I think we ended up finding more about him over time, about who he really was beyond these surface level facts and how he used his platforms at the time to push racist ideologies.
Kenneth, did you have a sense of surprise that, since you didn't grow up here, you came from New York City, did it surprise you that there was a name that was so prominent, even if it wasn't all that well identified, but a name that popped up all over the place, and then it turned out that there were these dimensions to that person that were problematic? Was that a surprise?
To be frank, not really, because I knew, coming to Georgia, even with the state flag, the old state flag was pretty much the Confederate flag, and so coming to the South, I knew that's what I was expecting, but I didn't expect it to be on such a wide platform as Henry Grady is.
Even from what you just said, it would sound like, as I would expect, that a young person coming from New York City, young African-American coming from New York City to Atlanta, that you'd probably have some expectation of running into racist things. Maybe you'd have a more expectation of that than would turn out to be the case. That's what people in Atlanta would hope, that you'd be anticipating more than you would find. How did it make you feel?
I mean, I wasn't surprised, but I was kind of disappointed. Atlanta, the motto of the city of Atlanta is the city too busy to hate. When I got to Atlanta, I was expecting, kind of that. And I got the Southern hospitality, I got the friendliness, I got the love. But then again, there are also things around the city of Atlanta who are just like, oh, okay, so we still believe that kind of a little bit. Okay. So it definitely, put me on edge. It definitely raised some red alarms for me. It's just kind of like, oh, we're still kind of dealing with this. And I was like, okay.
I happen to have here a printout of your editorial. You went back and you looked through the newspaper that he was publishing at the time and the kinds of articles that were in it and the sorts of headlines that appeared. And what you found was what you would find in probably most other newspapers from that period of time, and that would be a language that we wouldn't use today in reference to African Americans, but also maybe the most unsettling thing, at least to me as I look through what you guys put together, were these descriptions of mob violence against African Americans, and written in a kind of celebratory way oftentimes. But so there's a headline: "The triple trapeze, 3 Negroes hung to a limb of a tree. 2 minutes to pray before a rope dislocated their vertebra." Another one: "Lynching too good for the black miscreant who assaulted Mrs. Bush. He will be lynched." And so these were the kinds of things that some newspapers have issued apologies for. I'm not sure if the Atlanta Constitution has or not, and I should disclose that I'm a former employee of the Atlanta Constitution myself from long ago. Were you shocked to see those kinds of headlines?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, I don't think that whoever was writing those articles, whether it was Henry Grady or one of the other staffers, I don't think they were exercising what we would consider to be good news judgment today anyway. I mean, you're right, these were celebratory headlines, seemed to be soaked in opinion, so these weren't by any means objective articles. But even outside of the journalism world, no, these headlines are revolting.
And then there's also, he was a great speaker, and you guys talk about that. He was an orator, and that's really how he became famous outside of Atlanta in particular, and these very famous speeches that he made in New York City, where he talked about, used the term the New South. And I think he wasn't actually the very first person to coin that phrase. and that he talked about when he was in the North, these progressive changes and maybe the somewhat different place for African Americans in the South. But then in other times he would say things like, the supremacy of the white race of the South must be maintained forever, and the domination of the Negro race resisted at all points and at all hazards because the white race is the superior race.
And somebody who says something like that, period, does not belong on a pedestal in 2020. And that's the point we've been trying to make. Right. Those words, like, you can't say those things and then become celebrated decades later.
And that's from the speech. That's from the famous New South speech. He says, this is the declaration of no new truth has abided forever in the marrow of our bones and shall run forever with the blood that feeds Anglo-Saxon hearts. I mean, that is the kind of language that you'd find today in a neo-Nazi publication or something like that. I think after your editorial, and there had been some talk in Atlanta prior to that, like a discussion about some people suggesting that Grady High School shouldn't be named after him anymore, and also this suggestion of changing the name of the journalism school at the University of Georgia, which, by the way, is interesting because some of the most prestigious journalism awards in the country are granted by that school. But I think your editorial did bring a kind of attention on the monument that had not quite been there before. And then I read something later, some comments from descendants of Grady. Their message was not hostile, it didn't seem, but it also didn't agree with you. I mean, did you ever hear from any Grady family members, or directly or indirectly, or did you try to reach them? Were you curious? Are you curious? Their perspective on it.
So I remember when that piece came out. I was like, oh, okay. So we got, we're getting the conversation started. We got a response from somebody, and I don't know if he reached out. I know I was trying to get his contact information. Us being journalists, it's unethical to disclose contact information with things like that. But I thought it was interesting, getting that conversation started, not just amongst journalists, not just amongst students, but with people who have to literally deal with his history. That's his family. And they have to live with his history throughout their entire lives. And if they start interacting with people who know about his history, they're like, oh, did you know your grandfather kind of did this thing? It's like, oh, okay.
But now part of what their response appeared to be was to essentially to say, we understand that there are some things that he believed and some things that he said that would be objectionable today, but that he also was the architect of these ideas that were so important to Atlanta. And it is true that you guys have all been in Atlanta long enough to have absorbed that there is this, wonderful, sometimes annoying, but sort of infectious sense of that this is a city on the rise, or, there's always somebody, the city too busy to hate. This kind of, that this is the future city of the South and such. And so the idea that he was really the architect of that idea and that aspiration, and that still kind of permeates the personality of the city in some respects. And so the family members, the descendants, seem to be saying that, he should be remembered and honored for all those things, but we should acknowledge the bad stuff, but then not really offering up how that would be acknowledged. It reminded me a lot of when I was a kid, and I would ask my parents about my relatives, some of them who were the people I loved the most in the world, but who used racial epithets and lived in rural North Louisiana and were incredibly racist. And the answer that I would always get would be, well, he's a man of his time. That was the line, man of his time, and that was kind of an explanation. But does that apply? I mean, that's sort of what the Grady family members seem to be saying was, hey, give him a break. He was a man of his time. He couldn't help but have those kinds of racist ideas. But
I feel if he was a man of his time, that's not our time anymore. And I think that's the point we're going to make. I don't think we should forget what happened. I think we need to be very, very clear in acknowledging our past, as terrible as it is. And I think for us to say he was a man of his time, let's let him stick around, I think that just doesn't make sense. It's not adding up. And just because he was a man of his time doesn't mean what he believed in and viewed as what we want for our city now. Atlanta's changing. We can decide what Atlanta is going to be now and in the future. We don't just stick to what we've always been, clearly. And I think for his family, I understand it might be difficult to come to terms with something that's truly that negative. And maybe they don't see it as negative. I don't know. But you have to decide what you want the legacy to be going forward. You get the choice, what do you want it to be moving forward?
At least while we were writing it, the point of our article was not to disrespect Henry Grady. He was still, the proponent of the New South, the creator of modern Atlanta, modern Georgia, but at the same time, it's 2020, or at that time, 2019. You can't maintain the same racist ideals as we had in the late 1800s. We have to grow, and if we're going to grow, we can't continue to memorialize people who had those ideals that we don't respect anymore.
So what do you guys think is either for yourself or what you would imagine for other young people passing by that monument on Marietta Street? It's easy to, I was out there with you the other day, and, lots of cars whizzing by, and you didn't have the sense that people were slowing down and reading the words on the monument or saying, I wonder what that's about. They were just kind of blasting right past. Do you think that are there some people who absorb that it's there and make the connections and wonder about these things? Or do you think, or is it something that actively harms or causes pain for somebody when they actually see the monument or interact with the monument?
Yeah, that's interesting. I have a good friend of mine who, when we first published the editorial, almost didn't agree necessarily with the premise. Because he said, well, at the end of the day, this is just paint on the car. What are you doing to change the engine? My response to that was that Henry Grady, his statue, one, is the paint, but Henry Grady's words and the politicians that he supported, that's the engine. He actively campaigned to get the top KKK leader in Georgia elected governor, right? And fast forward, over a century later, and you see laws in Georgia that are built to protect statues like Henry Grady. I think that we still very much live in the remnants of what Henry Grady was trying to build. And I don't think that we can ignore that.
You don't get to a society where racism still persists so far into history without people like Grady laying those foundations long ago. And I think his symbolism is about that foundation that he laid that still exists today. And we're not talking about the foundation yet. We're just talking about his celebration, and the argument, like I said when we spoke at the statue, that it's just a statue is so much more than that. It's so much more than that.
Would it be possible to, if the descendants of Henry Grady or if the city of Atlanta or, some responsible party, if they wanted to put up a sign in front of the monument or right next to it, that explained that this is why this monument is here, but it is a person who also had views that were really objectionable, but we still have it here because of these other historic dimensions. Would that help? Would that fix? Would that be an approach?
If I remember correctly, the city of Atlanta did that. I'm not sure if they did specifically at the Henry Grady statue, but I know they did at the obelisk at Oakland. They did at the monument in Piedmont Park. The city of Atlanta has been trying to actively hey, this is a monument. Here's why it's here. Here's what it means. Trying to teach that history that the monument didn't originally teach. But for it to be on such a public street, just up the street on Marietta Street is Centennial Olympic Park, CNN, the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, it's a popular thoroughway. And then on the other side of the street, just down the street, is Andrew Young School of Policy here at Georgia State. And so for it to be on a popular street and for it to mean those things, I understand that we have to remember our history, teach our history, but I don't think a public street is the place to do it.
And we requested that at the bare minimum, that a plaque be put aside, the plaque that calls him an orator and a journalist and a patriot, explaining that how he used all three of those titles to promote racist ideologies. We asked for that in the editorial, and we had never received any notice of it. It definitely hasn't happened. The city of Atlanta The mayor hasn't taken any action to do so, especially even after the summer of Black Lives Matter protests and all that has taken place. It hasn't happened.
You know, one of the crazy things about the world that we live in now with in the world of journalism that you guys are going to encounter if you stay in the business is that you publish something and it's online and then you move on and maybe years go by and people keep adding comment. I just noticed that on the article that we were referring to that has the descendants of Henry Grady talking about all this and I think trying to be thoughtful, you know, to some degree at least. But someone added a comment to that to the comments on that article just 3 days ago. Just this week. It's from a woman named Tiffany Howard, and she says, "I am also a descendant of Henry Woodfin Grady, but I am Black. He owned my great-great-grandmother and sired my great-grandfather, thus creating a whole Black line that have lived in Athens and Atlanta since the 1800s. Seeing him honored so and never having acknowledged the fact that he was a slave owner is a constant reminder that we are the product of those abuses. We never received an apology." And she goes on and names some of the other members of the family and then says, "This has left an unhealed wound that you can't even imagine how it feels. We were used and cast aside and hidden, but we exist."
I mean, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but that's the common story that you see. You know, a lot of people, like, my mother's maiden name is McLeod. You know, until about middle school, I never put, you know, connection. I was like, McLeod is a name, whatever, until I had a white teacher whose last name was McLeod. I was like, well, how did that happen? How does that work out? Turns out my grandfather, I believe it was his grandmother, was owned by the McLeod family. And that's where that line came from. And, you know, that's a common story that you see across the South, where a lot of Black people who, when you trace down the line, came from white racist families who owned their families, and they can't trace their heritage back to Africa. And thank you to Tiffany for sharing her story, because I would have never known that there was a whole Black lineage of, you know, Henry Grady's children.
And of course, whether that's exactly accurate, you know, we'd have to figure that out. You know, yeah. But obviously those are the words of somebody who has received that history, and for them that is the history. It's almost like maybe it wouldn't necessarily matter even if it was exactly precise, you know, but because that is such a common dimension of the story of the South and story of really all African Americans who connect back to slavery in some fashion. But yeah, that's very powerful. Let's turn this a little bit to talk a little bit more about the connection between that statue and what we're talking about here and the Confederate monuments that have gotten so much more attention. And even at the time you guys did the editorial, there had been quite a lot of activity in other places in particular, and oftentimes student groups pulling down a Confederate monument. I think it was the first one that was pulled down was in Durham, North Carolina, that in the middle of the night. And then since then, there have actually been dozens of Confederate monuments around the country that have been taken down. There's still hundreds remaining, and I think there's still a running debate, including the ones in Atlanta, for a long time, because you know this has been a topic of great interest to me for a long time. I was a kid growing up in the Mississippi Delta, and I was fascinated with Confederate monuments, and I was fascinated with my own family's history, going back to probably any number of people who fought for the Confederacy, but some very specific people that I actually knew the identities of, but just poor people from rural Louisiana. But I was fascinated with all that, and I paid a lot of attention to monuments, started taking pictures of them. And today I have pictures of just, you know, and postcards and such of hundreds of these monuments. And what's interesting to me about them is that, for the longest time, when I would say to somebody, should these really still be here, you know, 100 years after the Civil War, 125 years after the Civil War? And even though most of them don't say explicitly racist things like Henry Grady was saying in those speeches, wouldn't these be offensive to some people, to some African Americans at least? And I was always struck by that for the longest time, almost no one cared. Certainly the people who you'd think would be opposed to them it really didn't seem to have registered as, as an issue. And then the defenders of them, though, were very, very strong defenders. The Sons of Confederate Veterans and such, very hostile to anything. And so I kind of thought that, this is something that'll just never change. This is just a permanent feature of the landscape. So it's been pretty crazy, really, to what has happened in the last year and a half. Why do you think that is?
I think America's just really had a really big re-education of our history. I think a lot of people are making effort to make sure we know exactly what happened and how we got to where we are and how that affects where we are today. I think we're having those important conversations. I think that that's just a culmination of everybody really wanting to know what really happened and how it affects us.
I think it's just, with everything that's going on, not just in the past year, but in the past, decade, everybody's really starting to have that conversation of, okay, here's where we're at. How do we get here? How are we still here? What, brought us to this point? And, as you start researching that, as you start reading into it, you're like, oh, okay, so that's what that random cannon off the side of Interstate 20, meant, or that random bust in Piedmont Park meant, or different things like that.
And so, did you guys, and the language on most of these monuments, there's some that had really racist language. Like there was one in New Orleans, it was one of the ones that was dismantled by the mayor of New Orleans, and another one of the really early steps in all of this stuff. But there was one, there was actually a monument not to the Confederacy or to a Confederate Union, but it was a monument essentially to a mob, to a vigilante group that attacked African Americans more in Henry Grady's period of time to suppress voting and suppress any sort of civic activism. And that monument actually had carved into the base of it the words white supremacy. It actually said the words white supremacy, and it's gone now. But most of the monuments say things like erected in honor or in remembrance of those who fought or those who suffered or died in defense, and very, very common language, in defense of the greatest society that has existed in all of human history. The bravest, the greatest, the most courageous, the most honorable, society in all of human history. And so they don't say this is put up here to remind black people that they shouldn't pursue civil rights or they shouldn't want to vote. It says these other things. But do you think those words, well, one, what do you think those sorts of words, those more ambiguous words, how would you interpret them, or any of you guys? Is it just lofty, bad poetry, or was there a meaning, a more sinister meaning buried in them?
I think it's very funny. I think it's very funny, actually.
Well, if we think about, when I can't even say a lot of it because, half of them were erected in the 60s and then the other half erected in the late 1800s. I'm sure they genuinely thought the South was, the greatest society the same way Germans think, Germany's the greatest society, the same way Britons think that they're the greatest society, and for speaking about the ones that were erected in 1800, these were their sons and their cousins and their fathers and their grandfathers who were fighting in this war. So I understand them. Well, they're American citizens. It was an American Civil War, but at the end of the day, they were fighting a war to effectively occupy a whole race of people. While I understand you want to show love and respect to the soldiers and love and respect to your family, they also were kind of fighting on the wrong side of the war, in my personal opinion. And, we have to recognize that while there's the good things, you have to recognize the bad. And sometimes the bad outweighs the good.
And I think it's almost worse in a way for me that there's some statues like Grady's that don't have any acknowledgement of what he was relating to. It just makes him look like this great historical figure, because it's almost like he has this like white privilege beyond the grave where he can just be celebrated, and the things he did that were bad are just kind of pushed aside. We won't talk about those here in this place. We'll just put him on his pedestal. It's just I think that's very frustrating, in my opinion.
Right. I find it funny. Only because I think to call that band of southern states that became the Confederacy the greatest society, what is it, on earth, essentially?
In human history.
In human history? Like I think it's funny because so many reputable historians and economists have come out, both recently and throughout the last couple of decades, to say that this economy that was built on slaves wasn't sustainable in the first place. So to call something like that the greatest in history is I think, a little ironic. But even beyond that, I think that these, Kenneth, you have a good point, because half of these statues were sort of built on this lost cause narrative. You know, these are sort of somewhat recent, you know, comparatively speaking, statues that were built to celebrate this vision that was never fully executed on. And then you have some statues like Henry Grady's who were actually constructed in the 1800s. I think, if my knowledge serves correctly, there was a band when Henry Grady, I think he died fairly young, right, of an illness. And when he died, there was sort of a band of you know, Atlantans that wanted to raise money and build a statue. That, you know, I can empathize with that, and, you know, have never advocated for that statue to be destroyed. Think it should be moved into a more, you know, something in context, right? Whether it's a plaque or move it to the History Center. I think that I can empathize with that to a degree. But these statues that were erected, like you said, in the 60s, to celebrate this narrative, this lost cause narrative, it's ridiculous.
It's also interesting to me in all of this that the Confederate monuments, particularly the ones that were built much closer to the time of the Civil War, and there were some that, like the first one in Atlanta, that you referred to it earlier, the obelisk, I think, which is a very spare monument. When it was erected in 1972, it's in the center of a military graveyard in Oakland Cemetery. But it's a very spare obelisk with, and the only words on it are "Our Confederate Dead." That's all. That's all it says. Interestingly enough, if you go to Germany and if you go to military burial places from World War II and World War I, very common thing is that the monuments, there'll be one central monument in a military graveyard there, and it will typically be one big slab of granite, just one large piece of stone, unadorned, and it'll have just two words on it, "Unsere Helden," our heroes. And that's all that it says. And on the back, it'll usually have all the names of the dead there listed by war. And it struck me that that one monument, that very plain monument in Atlanta that just says "Our Confederate Dead," and it was erected just a few years after the Civil War, that's an expression of grief. You know, it's a very honest expression of grief. And for people that had died and the people remembered. But then you have these other monuments later that seem to be, that have very different meanings. But it is also interesting that Grady, who you guys zeroed in on, that the things he was writing about are really more related to the system we live in today. He was a part of the South that took the vote away, from emancipated African Americans and created this new system of oppression of African Americans. So in some respects, Confederate monuments might be more defensible than a monument to Henry Grady in that sense.
And like Danny said, he put people in positions of power that put other people in positions of power that, over decades and decades got us to where we are today. No matter what, it's not excusable.
But what do you say to somebody who would, come in and say, look, you're talking about my great-great-great-grandfather and who sacrificed all these things, and it really matters to me that by suggesting these monuments shouldn't be there, you're actually dishonoring, you're trying to take away the memory of these good dimensions of this person. What do you say to that voice?
Put it in context. We don't want to, none of us here, and we all talked about this very heavily, how important it was to us in the writing of this that we don't want his statue destroyed. We want it in context. We want, what he actually did to be evident.
We don't want history to be forgotten. We want history to be remembered. But we want history to be remembered, within the context,
accurately.
In the view, in the span of other history. And that's why in the article, we advocated very strongly for it not to be destroyed, but to be moved to the History Center or another museum where it can be viewed in the same span as other historical monuments. When you go to the History Center, you're expecting to learn something. When you're driving down Marietta Street, if you just happen to glance and be like, oh, what's that? And you research it, you're like, oh, okay, so, this is what, the city still kind of believes. And so if we never advocated for history to be destroyed. We advocate for history to be in context, as Ada said.
It's dangerous to erase it, extremely dangerous, because then you're not learning from those mistakes. And that is the most important part of all of it. I think he shouldn't just get to, I actually believe if he were to be destroyed, that would be giving him some more grace than he probably deserves.
Let's pause and take a look at some video of some things that happened with Confederate monuments recently in Atlanta and nearby.
Back here in Georgia, the Decatur obelisk will be removed this month.
Well, this comes after a judge signed an emergency motion to have the monument removed.
We just need to proceed to remove monuments of this site and put them where they belong, which is in the museum.
Hearing the news, the Confederate obelisk in Decatur Square is finally coming down.
It took, unfortunately, protest in order for us to get to this place, as well as people losing their lives.
A motion was filed by the city's attorney saying the obelisk was a public nuisance and created a danger to the public. This comes after protests over the death of George Floyd once again made the monument a target. In the motion, it states the risk of the public doing harm to themselves trying to remove the obelisk means the city must remove this danger. It was already meant to be removed by the county, but they have struggled to find a museum or any other suitable place that would accept it.
That's really what the Confederate Memorial is about. It's about remembrance of the men who fought and died during the Civil War for DeKalb County and their families who suffered terribly during that year, 1864.
You know, it'd be nice to see maybe a statue of Hosea Williams or Martin Luther King Jr., but I don't have any issue with that being removed whatsoever.
That Confederate Memorial is about remembrance. It's not about white supremacy, and it's not about the Ku Klux Klan.
We were marching in 10th grade trying to get this monument down, passing out flyers to our classmates in the cafeteria and stuff. So it's a really emotional thing to actually finally see it come down.
What we just saw was the removal in an organized kind of way. It wasn't mobs pulling down monuments, but it definitely was, like in the case of some of the video that we just saw, was of a Confederate monument being removed from the historic square of Decatur, Georgia, right next to Atlanta, and that happened after agitation by a student group and some other citizens, but then ultimately it was a judge, a local judge, who ordered that the monument be taken down in a expeditious way, I think on the basis of a public safety argument of some sort. But is that what should happen? Should it be that however many remaining 200 or 300 of those kinds of monuments that are out there should they be removed? Or if, as is the case with most of them in Georgia and several other states, new laws have been passed to try to prevent their removal, should citizens go out and just take them down themselves? Or, you know, what should happen? Because obviously once a mob pulls them down or protest, then they're probably not going to end up in the History Center.
I understand, you know, I can sympathize people that, you know, have suffered or their family has suffered in historical context, being angry enough to want to do something like that. You know, I do think that the most appropriate action would be for the government officials to take action and put it in context and put it in a history center or give it a plaque. But I can understand why people would be angry enough to take that action.
I mean, I will admit, like, my thoughts aren't fully formed on this topic, but I think that my gut reaction is that we have to recognize that a government requires the consent of the governed. And a statue, you know, like the one that you've just referred to, is, I believe it's on public property. It's regardless supported and protected by laws that our government has passed on the state level. And if the citizens of that area decide that this are the due process that you usually would go through to have that law repealed isn't working, and they've tried that due process over and over and over again, and you get to the point where you are exhausted and emotionally just you know, torn apart by this, I don't know that it's my place to judge them for doing that. Obviously, I would prefer for us to do this the completely, like, the civil way. That's kind of why we did what we did in the first place. We studied the law. We asked specifically for two things. We asked for a plaque, and then we asked for, you know, the mayor to publicly advocate for a state law to be repealed. I think that we wielded our platform in a civil way. But is it my place to judge those individuals who did that? I don't know that it is.
Let's just accept at face value that what you've said about the Henry Grady statue makes total sense. That things that he said at the time that were not offensive, at least not offensive to white people, I think they probably were very offensive to African Americans at the time, but that as time goes by, the offensiveness of those remarks has become more and more obvious as society has evolved, and so it makes sense to go back and reassess him and maybe undo some of the honor that he was given. But is there anything worrisome about that, for instance, Woodrow Wilson, who's president in the early 1900s, in the 20th century, honored in big ways the Woodrow Wilson Peace Center in Washington, D.C., and remembered as a great statesman and an architect of international peace agreements and such, also was a raging white supremacist who extended segregation all through the federal government. If we look at all the faces on Mount Rushmore, we can take all of them except perhaps Lincoln, though even Lincoln we can say, well, his views on race and on slavery weren't, at least at the beginning, were not what they should have been. But we can begin to dissect all of these historical figures and find objectionable things that they said, particularly with the passage of time. We can also go back and look at the Honorable Elijah Muhammad or the Honorable Farrakhan, Minister Farrakhan, and find things that many people would find very offensive in racial terms, from much more recent times. And so how do we draw a box around, or can we put a box around a way of dealing with that? That it's almost inevitable that many public figures at some point in the future will look uglier than they did in their day.
Yeah, I think it's a process we're going through, and I think the thing you've got to do is acknowledge the mistakes and take action to fix them. It's really simple. I mean, there are often repercussions that you'll have to face, and you have to accept those as well. But I mean, if you're willing to acknowledge your mistakes and take action to resolve any damage you've caused, I think that's what people who are in positions like that, if they're still alive anyway, need to be doing. Just don't walk right past it. Don't try to fight it. Accept it and see what you can do to improve.
Yeah, and we live in a very unique time in history where not only is our past being brought to attention, but our recent past and our present being brought to attention. It's almost like every day people are getting, talked to on Twitter. It's like, hey, you tweet this thing 2 years ago. It's like, hey, you kind of can't say that anymore. And people are really coming to terms with, hey, you really have to. You can have your opinions. You're more than valid to have your opinions, but sometimes you really just got to keep your opinions to yourself and not keep it in the public sphere.
Yeah, and if you have those opinions, be prepared to deal with how people react to them and how the consequences of sharing those opinions. We have freedom of speech, but if people don't like what you have to say, that's just part of the world we live in.
In addition to Henry Grady and the figure that he was in the 1880s, that period of time in Atlanta history, some of the people he was allied with that you guys have made reference to, like General John Gordon, the Ku Klux Klan leader, whose statue is on the grounds of the state capitol today and protected by state law. But some of the people he was allied with at that time were the early industrialists of Atlanta and people who made great fortunes in that period of time and invested in enterprises that are still with us. Some of the biggest corporations in Atlanta today have roots back into that period of time and into enterprises that we now understand, these incredibly terrible abuses of African-American laborers and people who were arrested on trumped-up charges so that they could be sold into coal mines or in these brick-making plants. And so that's another dimension of this debate of how to remember these figures who, on the one hand, are pioneering entrepreneurs of modern Atlanta, but on the other hand, are connected to these really terrible things. And one of those historical figures was a man named Joel Hurt, who's better known as a real estate developer in Atlanta, of a very nice part of Atlanta at the beginning of the 20th century. But he also built a very beautiful, ornate building in downtown Atlanta that still stands, called the Hurt Building. And it's right in the thick of the campus of Georgia State University. And just a block away is a public park called Hurt Park, and a fountain there that's called the Hurt Fountain and has his name emblazoned across it. And that's something that thousands and thousands of students and other citizens pass by every day. And there's not any acknowledgement of these terrible atrocities that went on at enterprises that are really the things that made that family wealthy and able to do other things. What do we do about that?
I mean, I fought so hard to have that conversation in the editorial as well. But Danny and Ada were like, no, we have to really, zero it in. And, the purpose of our editorial was to start the conversation. And now that the conversation is started, we can have a conversation about Joel Hurts and Robert Woodruff and Wilson and all the other people across the country who have these questionable actions and questionable ideals. And we've started the conversation, and it's now the time to continue that conversation.
Yeah, the sad part is we could have made our editorial about any one of the people that Kenneth just named. There's a lot of people we could have talked about and addressed, and it was important to set an example, and we used Grady as an example because it's a very easy example, I believe, in all the ways that he celebrated. It's easy to prove that he was not the best, most respectable person, and that's the same for a lot of other people like Hurt. And Grady is the example we set in that editorial. You could apply that same thought pattern to any of these people and find the same results.
I agree. I think that there was one overarching, albeit unstated, goal of that editorial that we wrote, and that was to raise awareness around the context of Henry Grady's life. I would love to see the next editorial board of the Signal or any other student newspaper in Atlanta write an editorial taking on the legacy of Joel Hurt. But until then, what we can do is continue to message the research that we've done around Henry Grady.
And we even did a second editorial after that one. When Danny was editor-in-chief at the time when the first one was written, and I believe the first one had more impact, I do. But the second one we wrote, during the summer of the protest happening in Atlanta, kind of making a nod towards the fact that, hey, we've been calling attention to this before, it still matters now. It's very important that we address this now rather than later.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I appreciate all three of you, both the story of what you did in that editorial that sparked off the conversations that it did, and they're complicated topics and a little risky. It's exactly the kind of crucial conversation that we try to engage in here, so thank you for joining.